Hello and welcome to NIAGA Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. NIAGA Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now this week on Future Affairs, we delve into the hot topic of GLC and GLIC investments. Now Malaysia's GLICs hold combined assets under management, or AUM, valued at over 1.8 trillion ringgit. This is roughly the size of Malaysia's nominal GDP. Now this entails a financial capacity to effect the nation's ascent in the economic value chain and of course transform Malaysian lives for the better if AUM is transparently and accountably managed. Now, if audits uncover, let's say, just around 1 million ringgit in savings per company, the total could reach 2 billion ringgit, resources that could be redirected towards innovation as well as growth. The Auditor-General now holds the authority to audit the accounts of over 1,856 entities, including government-linked companies, GLCs, following the enactment of the Audit Amendment Order, which took effect just on November the 1st. NIAGA Spotlight today focuses on a timely discussion of transparency and accountability for GLC and GLICs to improve Malaysia's overall economic landscape. Dr. Edmund Terence Gomez, Honorary Professor with University Malaya, and Ira Azhari, Acting CEO with Ideas Malaysia, join me now for this timely discussion. Very good morning. How are the both of you doing?
Good morning.
Very good, thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for making time. Prof, if I could start off by asking you to delve a little deeper into how the government's frameworks of Malaysian GLCs and GILCs could actually be restructured, because we're looking now at enhancing accountability as well as transparency in operations and decision-making processes.
The question that you have raised draws attention to a larger ecosystem, what we like to call now the GLC ecosystem, because it's not just GLCs and GLICs. There's a whole range of different types of institutions. We have the sovereign wealth funds, we have the pension funds, we have the foundations, the holding companies, the list just goes on and on. We can't narrow it down only to the GLCs and the GLICs. Now, what I would like to focus on is the power structure, the governance structure. Ultimately, in this huge ecosystem, the power over this system is concentrated in the office of the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. And in this case, we have the one and the same person. We also know that corruption is rampant in this ecosystem, not just the GLCs and the GLICs. Here, we bring in the National Audit Department and what they have said. They have empowered the National Audit Department. They said they're going to give them extra powers to go and look at this system. But interestingly, they said they are going to look at 2,000 gazetted enterprises. We have far more than 2,000 enterprises. Now they've reduced it to 1,856. That means they themselves don't know exactly how many enterprises there are in this ecosystem. So my concern is this: who exactly are you going to audit? And at which level is the corruption most pervasive? And I think the corruption is not pervasive as much as the top layers of the ecosystem, but at the bottom layers, and there are many layers because we have the GLICs which control GLCs, which control companies which have their own subsidiaries, and you will find that most of the corruption is at the lower layers. Will those areas be audited? So here we really need to talk about a restructuring of the entire GLC ecosystem if you want to do a proper governance of these enterprises under the government's control.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for framing it from that really broad top-down perspective. Ira, what about your thoughts when it looks at the operations and decision-making processes, a lot of which is currently in the spotlight and in news headlines with the ongoing investigations regarding Fashion Valet, for example. But what does that really boil down to? Because this is all happening post-revelations, right? And also from more than a year or so ago, because they're finally being acted upon. And there are, as Prof mentioned, thousands of others potentially.
Yeah, so I think, you know, when we talk about this, the issue of GLCs, corruption, we tend to forget what actually is the role of the government as the principal owner of these companies, right? So the government has a very important role in the economy, but I think in Malaysia it has been sort of skewed to thinking government as the political interference, I think, is the problem in Malaysia, right? So we need to see how government can play the role as an active and informed owner, as opposed to but not by political interference. So I think there is a lot of, when we talk about political appointments in GLCs, which, is in the news almost every week about this, there is always a discussion about, we need to have these people on the boards, politicians and MPs on the boards, because there is a public mandate. But the risk of doing that is you open up these entities to political interference, and instead, why can't we see the government as an owner that has clear objectives for these entities, for GLICs, GLCs, right? And to appoint professional independent board members. So a lot of what's happening with in the news regarding Fashion Valet is there's been a lot of discussion about what was the rationale
behind
these investments, right?
Yes, correct.
So, why? What was the decision making process like, as you mentioned? So, the issue is there is no transparency there. So, you have a board, Khazanah and PNB obviously have boards. The Prime Minister chairs the board of Khazanah, but is there room for us as the public to scrutinize the rationale behind the investments that are made by these two very, very important and huge GLICs in Malaysia? So I think that room for scrutiny is almost non-existent. So with GLICs like Khazanah and PNB, it's slightly better because they have annual reports that are being made public. But we must also take into account the numerous GLCs that these GLICs invest into, that not all of them are transparent. And, we don't even know how many there are. So 1,800, 2,000 or more, right? So there is a fundamental issue of a lack of transparency and accountability here.
Absolutely. And of course, there was a recent announcement by the Prime Minister who did say that there would be a specific cut in bonuses for underperforming GLCs and also the GLICs. However, that appears to be a measure which perhaps is not speaking towards better governance, but more as a threat mechanism. So let's move on into something more tangible. Let's look at performance metrics.
Yeah.
Prof, now what specific performance metrics, in your view, could be implemented to evaluate effectiveness of GLCs and GLICs? We ought not to have to wait until these reports come out and it's already a spotlight in the news, and then of course there's pressure on the government of the day to make such announcements.
I'd like to put this in the context of the government's or the Prime Minister's announcement that he's going to do. There's going to be more auditing of these institutions. Now, when he spoke about the auditing of these institutions, he talked about GLCs broadly, not just the GLICs and the GLCs.
That's right.
Now, I want to draw attention to one important category which we have to discuss, which is statutory bodies. A key component of the ecosystem are statutory bodies. And much of the corruption that we see occurring happens in the statutory bodies. Recently in Parliament, we had this big discussion on MARA and FALCRA. They are statutory bodies. Now, for the sake of clarity, a statutory body is an organization set up by law.
Yeah.
There are about 135 statutory bodies regulated by a law. Each of them have a law. These statutory bodies can and should have, or these statutory bodies have a very specific social role. That's why they were set up. They had a social role to play.
They have a mandate.
They had a
to
mandate to do
people.
something.
Yeah.
That's why they have a law behind them. But these statutory bodies then went on to set up companies, GLCs.
The corporatization,
which
yes.
comes to your question about the GLCs. So when we're talking about GLCs, we must know these GLCs are under which institution. Ira spoke about under the GLICs. I like to speak under the statutory bodies. Now here we have a problem of performance. When the audit department comes to audit a statutory body, what are they auditing? Are they auditing whether they are performing their social obligations, or are they auditing the companies and the profits they make? Actually, the role of the National Audit Department is to make sure the statutory bodies do what they were set up to do. It's not just about profits.
That's right. They're not only looking
and
at
losses.
the books, right?
Even the Prime Minister recently said it's not about profits and losses. It's about functionality. And that's what we need to get into. Now, this comes back to the question, and this was also raised, what is the purpose of the government intervening and setting up these statutory bodies to do a specific function? Is it doing that? And is their role to do that social function, or is it to go into business? And it's when they go into business that we see all the problems coming up. And then we have dual functionality. Make profits and do your social obligations. And they can't do both.
Exactly.
And that's where everything collapses. So this comes back to your point about performance. When we talk about performance criteria, what exactly are we looking at when we ask them, are you performing? Are we going to judge them based solely on whether they make money? When that's not their role. Their role is to, are you eradicating poverty? Are you redistributing wealth properly?
That return on equity and return of assets,
That's
right? Ira, your thoughts on like perhaps an actual framework for performance metrics, because that's possibly the missing part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, all GLCs, GLICs should have a performance charter. So in the performance charter, you have that lays out very clear expectations of what should be achieved within a given time frame. And this can be revised like annually or biannually, and this should be made transparent to the public. And, you know, I completely agree with Prof. In this performance charter, it's not necessarily like this is how much profit you should make, right? But this is how much you are returning to the Malaysian people through development projects or scholarships, equity, right? And all of this needs to be made clear, and there needs to be a system of accountability. And for those that set up for social objectives, there should also be clear
social impact index of sorts,
like clear output and outcome, where it's very clearly defined, right? And I think the problem is, how are these social objectives also funded? So this is the thing. Then you do business, and then you get profits, and then that, you know, is supposed to then fund your social objectives. Then there's a mixing up of objectives there. So this needs to be made very clear. Social objectives, profits, and no one, I think, is really asking this question about these dual objectives. And this is sort of an identity crisis that I think our state-owned enterprises in general is facing.
Exactly.
I'd like to build on one point that Ira made in terms of what exactly is their role. Now let's talk about something more tangible so that everyone understands where we are going with this. Fashion Valley, which is in the news now. Khazanah and PNB invested in Fashion Valley. It was like a company which was supposed to be a new unicorn, a startup that is going to thrive, so we invest in them. That is the role of Khazanah. Khazanah is a sovereign wealth fund, will identify companies where they can invest in, which have a potential of growing and supporting these companies. That is not the role of PNB. PNB is supposed to function as an investment.
It's a mutual fund, right?
Mutual fund. Yeah. They invest in equity. They don't go and venture into risky operations and get involved in operations here. So this comes back to the issue is, are the institutions that were set up doing what they were supposed to do or not? And if they're doing things which they're not supposed to do, that's something the National Audit Department should actually look into and say, look, this is not your role.
Exactly.
That's an important role for the National Audit Department, I like to stress. You know, it's not just going and checking the accounts. It's checking their performance, as you mentioned.
And while you can't, of course, cry over spilled milk, hopefully now with the updated legislation as of November 1st, this gives the National Audit Department clear directions in which to head. Right. Moving on into, of course, stakeholder engagement now, which would, of course, be a potential immediate or medium to long-term step. Now, in what ways can Malaysian GLCs and GLICs improve stakeholder engagement to ensure that public interests are also prioritized in strategic decisions? Ira, particularly at the federal and subnational levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think stakeholder engagement is, of course, important, but I feel that, you know, if the mandate of the, you know, the mandate on the economic and social objectives of these entities are made clear and transparent in the first place, then, you know, you probably don't even need to get into a conversation of stakeholder engagement, because there is a place that the public can go to access information on what their purpose are. And if it's clearly spelled out in a public charter, social objectives are properly financed, annual reports are available online, you know, then it's clear to the public what the purpose is. So I would emphasize more on that. And, you know, it may even not be necessary for these GLCs and GLICs to go on the ground and engage with public stakeholders. Remember, we have thousands of GLCs out there and we don't even know how many there are. So I think, there needs to be a really serious effort, and I don't know, maybe the National Audit Department can play a role in this, in increasing and improving transparency in the first place. So, and I think there needs to be a whole rethinking behind the objectives of these entities. And, the men and women governing them, sitting on their boards, need to really understand that there is a strong public mandate. There is, they are holding these entities in trust for the public. And that needs to be really sort of taken very, very seriously, because I think right now, because of this sort of identity crisis, multiple dual objectives, no one is really clear on what the mandate is. So I would say that I would emphasize more on that, and it's really important. Secondly, I would say that we need to empower Parliament's role in all of this, right? So, ideally there should be a parliamentary committee that can scrutinize and keep these entities, GLCs, GLICs, accountable beyond just the Public Accounts Committee, because the PAC, it's a post facto thing. So when some big corruption scandal happen, I mean, think of the LCS issue, that's when they will come in and investigate and question officials, right? But there needs to be something before that.
An ongoing review.
An ongoing review and more scrutiny by our MPs that are... So that's where the public comes in, because we elect them.
Yes, you give them your mandate.
So we give them the mandate to keep these state-owned enterprises in check. Yeah.
Your thoughts on this, Prof?
This is an important question on the stakeholder. When the institutions were set up, they had a public engagement role. They engage with the public. They are servicing the public. They're helping people in need. So there's supposed to be an interaction. So let's take Felda, Felcra, Mara. They engage with people. There should be a communication going on here. But is that happening?
And other voices being heard, as in the recent case of Felda, where, of course, the farmers have attempted their best to collectivize, but is it reaching?
That's right. It should be bottom-up. Just as the government is coming in and intervening to help them, you have to hear their voices exactly. Are their voices being heard, or has it turned into an institution which is now top-down? Everything is top-down, they have no say. Now, when these institutions were set up, there were not many of them. We go back to the 1950s. And in 1970, okay, then we saw a lot more coming up. But today...
Yeah, fast forward 60 years.
As I said, today we have no clue how many there are. So when we talk about stakeholder engagement, who exactly are the stakeholders going to engage with when they don't even know how many there are? Now, I'd like to talk about solutions. If you look at other countries, we are not the only country where we have these enterprises going in and intervening. Many countries have these state-owned enterprises. We call them GLCs. Indonesia and China have a commission or an institution to oversee these institutions. This is all clear. It's all parked there. And we know exactly how many there and who we are dealing with. Do you know, in Malaysia, in 1974, we set up a ministry for the coordination of public enterprises?
Oh, yes, I didn't know that.
In 1974.
Okay, a little before my time, physically speaking, but yes, okay, fascinating.
And then
we should reinvigorate that.
They changed it to the Ministry of Public Enterprises. It was called the Ministry of Public Enterprises. And all of them were situated there, and we knew where to go to get information on these public enterprises. But for some reason, the government disbanded it in 1995. And that's when they really also began to take off in a huge way. So now we have no transparency, now we have no accountability, now we don't even have knowledge of it. It's an opaque world. And this raises the question of stakeholder engagement. How can there be stakeholder engagement when the whole world is opaque? And even the NED, the National Audit Department, when they go in and they look at this world, who exactly are they auditing? When
That's right. Thanks very much. I love the fact that you were able to frame it. Prof. Terence, Ira, great conversation. We do go off into a very quick break. We will be right back with the rest of the discussion on GLCs and GLICs, transparency and accountability on NIAGA Spotlight. Welcome back to NIAGA Spotlight. Still with me, Tamina Kausji. And today, live in the studios, we are discussing GLC and GLIC transparency and accountability with Prof. Terence Gomez, University Malaya, Honorary Professor, and Ira Azhari, Acting CEO with IGS Malaysia. Right, so getting back into the discussion, let's go into audit practices and how actually independent auditing practices can be strengthened within GLCs, GLICs, because of course we want to ensure compliance with best practices in financial reporting. Ira, some initial thoughts on this?
Financial reporting. You were asking about audit, right?
That's right.
Yeah, I think the National Audit Department, of course, has a very, very important role. But I would also emphasize the role of the audit committee within the boards of these GLICs and GLCs. So in a properly governed company, the board of directors will have different committees. So the audit committee is the one that's supposed to supervise the internal audit of the company. And this is why we need to appoint independent and also credible and qualified people to sit on the boards and not treat them as a place where you can put political appointees, or even worse, reward people who sometimes have lost the election and you need to give them something, and you put them on these boards. Ex officio civil servants or retired civil servants, how do we know what their capabilities and qualifications are? So if you have an independent audit committee within boards, then before it even goes to the National Audit Department, there is already a layer of scrutiny within these companies that is extremely important. So this is why we keep emphasizing that we cannot have political appointees and sitting politicians in these boards, because there is just too much risk of conflict of interest. How are you supposed to make independent decisions for the benefit of the company when you are, beholden to a certain political party, or you're a member of a certain political party, and even worse, you are a current active politician. So this is something that we need to really emphasize about, and I really hope that in this the current conversation or hoo-ha in the news about Khazanah, PNB and Fashion Valet can open up discussions about the importance of independent board members.
Fair enough, absolutely. I hear you on that. And also when it comes to appointment of external auditors with enhanced independence as well as rotation. Speaking to that, Doctor.
No, first let me say this. There are ample legislation in place to monitor these government agencies. We have the Statutory Bodies Account and Annual Reports Act, for example. I want to come back to that because they are supposed to submit their annual report to the NAD. They're also supposed to submit it to the minister in charge of these bodies, who is also responsible for submitting it to Parliament.
Right.
There's a system in place. And that system in place allows for the checks and balances. So why is it that this system is not working? That's the question we must ask. There's another act which oversees the point about the directors of these institutions. And if they're not performing, there's an act which can also discipline them. Why is that not working? And below them, we have the Companies Act, which oversees all the GLCs which are incorporated under the Companies Act. They have to be audited every year by law.
Yeah.
They have to be audited by an independent, that's coming to your question, an independent auditing company must come in and audit the accounts. Why haven't they raised red flags on what's happening when we know there are a lot of transgressions occurring? So what does this mean? The system in place, which is actually quite good, you've got all the regulations in place,
right.
The corporate governance criteria are in place, but the system is not working. And that's the question we got to get into. Why is the system not working? And this comes back to the issue which I raised earlier. I feel power is concentrated too much in the office of the one arm of government. That would be the executive arm of government. Ultimately, it all goes back to them. And they have the authority to also allow for what can be investigated and what should not be investigated. Are these bodies independent? Are the directors who are appointed, as Ira said, truly independent of the executive arm of government? These are the issues we need to get into if we want to clean up the system to stop the wastages that you talked about in your introduction, to curb the corruption that is happening on the ground. And this then speaks to the issue of political will. Is there real political will on the part of the executive arm of government to curb corruption when they're not willing to devolve power to make these institutions independent, to allow them to do their work independent of the executive oversight that is currently over them? Or officially, the NED is supposed to be independent. Officially, it's the Auditor-General is appointed by the King on the advice of the Prime Minister. But is that really how the system works? Is she truly autonomous? These are the questions we need to pose if we want to get to the heart of the matter of solving the problems that we are discussing today.
Absolutely, fair enough. And also when it comes to the companies themselves, a really transparent process for basically auditor selection, including public disclosure, which can then, of course, minimize risks of a lack of transparency and accountability, right? All right. So now moving on into another area, looking at our policy frameworks, right? So let's look at the current slew of national policies that we have guiding operational transparencies of GLC, GLICs, and how can we then now optimize to make sure these policies are able to mitigate risks of mismanagement and corruption? Ira.
Yeah, so of course in the past we all remember that there was a GLC transformation program. We had the different coloured books, the green book and so on, and had actually pretty substantial guidelines on GLC governance, leadership. But the problem with that was that it only covered a very limited number of GLCs, and then so the guidelines were not taken up by all of them because they were not obligatory, right? They were just guidelines, and they were part of that administration. And as we always see in Malaysia, when we change Prime Minister, change administrations, then people kind of forget.
A recurring issue of institutional memory, right?
Yes, exactly. So this is why a lot of things in Malaysia actually needs to be codified in law for it to work. So in all of these things needs to be institutionalized. So the funny thing is with GLICs, a lot of them are, so they are statutory bodies, right? So they are formed, their formation is by statute. So you need to kind of look back at those laws that establish these entities and what do those laws say. So one of the key problems with the statutes that establish these institutions is it gives a lot of power to the minister to appoint board members, for example. So this is a key area of reform. And the other thing I wanted to touch on is the current policy on board appointments is based on a circular which was issued this year, but it superseded the one that was issued in 1998. Right. So the issue with circular, so a lot of sort of procedures within Malaysia government is done by circular. So the problem with circulars is they can just be circumvented or ignored pretty easily when a different government comes in. So this is why a lot of the practices are not institutionalized, and when a new and now, you know, it's becoming more of a norm for us to have different administrations, different political parties in power, which is, I would say, healthy for a multi-party democracy. But then comes into the question of how do we ensure that reforms, good governance is not at the whim and fancy of new governments or prime ministers. So this is why I would say that we need to have probably an act that governs state-owned enterprises, which is quite a norm in many other countries that have these kinds of entities that actually like codifies, solidifies what the proper appointment process is, what are the charters, what is the mandate of these entities. So it's standardized, right, across all the different types of state-owned entities that we have.
Yeah, and naturally that hopefully leads to tangible outcomes. Prof. Terence, any thoughts on implementation of the current framework that we have for anti-corruption and integrity standards, and what maybe is still lacking?
I like to link that point to policy.
Sure.
Because this discussion that we are having is that when we have a policy, the GLCs and the GLICs were established to implement those policies. So if you want them to do it in a proper, transparent, based on integrity and level playing field, that's where all these issues come into play. Are they doing it that way? Now, first, I agree with Ira, we need a GLC Act to monitor this, to make sure that they are doing it according to how they were asked to do their work. The second point, in 1997 we had the Asian financial crisis that was attributed to abuse of many of the state government enterprises. They came up with corporate governance reforms. And the OECD said that Malaysia had one of the best corporate governance reforms introduced in the world. So why is it, when we had these reforms targeting companies, including the GLCs, why is it that we still have corruption, including of the scale such as 1MDB, which is a company under the Companies Act? So again, it comes back to the issue of the structure of the state to allow for the monitoring of these abuses that are going on within the system. There's a serious flaw there. The second point, and this we have to pay attention to, the government is today saying they have to intervene even more. They've come up with a gear up policy where they have targeted the 6 GLICs. They're giving them 120 billion ringgit.
That's correct.
They're also telling them, go into key sectors. They've even allocated sectors that these GLICs must go into. And that raises the question, is that their work too? But we'll come to that at another time. But 120 billion ringgit over the next 5 years, that's a policy with funds going in to be channeled to the ground through these GLICs. I am worried. First, is that their role? Secondly, is there enough transparency and accountability? Even today, we know corruption is rampant. We're putting that kind of money in the system to be channeled down to the ground. There's no stakeholder engagement that we are seeing. There's nothing bottom-up that's coming up. So the system is ready and ripe for abuse. There's also the Putra 35 policy. I have to discuss this because we are discussing patronage. When we set up the GLC system, ecosystem, we also introduced a patronage system, selective patronage, targeting particular ethnic groups. Now, when we did that, it opened up the system for abuse when it was captured by politicians, and they were not targeting the poor, they were targeting themselves. And contracts which were supposed to be given to...
a closed loop, essentially.
To entrepreneurial business people, Bhumi Putras were now being given to party members. Now we have a Putra 35 policy in place, which is replicating policies of old. We are taking government funds and government concessions and targeting it down to the ground. This has to be audited. This is the role of the National Audit Department. Are they doing it properly as per what the policy says they are supposed to do? Forget the accounts. Let's talk implementation. Let's talk implementation of policies. That's the National Audit Department's role.
And even when it comes to implementation policies, I'm also thinking of the fact that have we yet to establish clear channels for whistleblowing and also creating transparency regarding procurement processes, which of course will boil down into what exactly will happen to that 120 billion that you referred to. Fantastic. A lot to discuss here. However, I'd like to move on and perhaps round up the entire discussion by a little focus on intergovernmental coordination. Now, coordination between federal and state governments will also need to be improved to ensure that public financial management practices related to our GLC, GLICs actually promote transparency and accountability. Some initial thoughts for this, Ira?
Yeah, I think what people don't realize is that we have state-level GLCs as well, and we have plenty of them, and many of them are needed, right? They play a very important role, developmental role in the states, and which is why it is increasingly important for there to be very strict transparency and accountability measures there as well. So one thing, maybe, you know, if the federal government adopts a law on in GLC Act or State Enterprises Act, it is really important that this is followed suit at the state level as well, because we have a slew of state level GLCs, which, you know, at least with the federal level GLCs, there is a lot of scrutiny, and you know the media pays a lot of attention to them when any scandal or corruption happens. But at the state level, who knows what's going on there, because there is so little scrutiny. Our state legislative assemblies don't sit long enough, you know, to even have any oversight role on state level GLCs. Our aduns are not empowered enough to do that. So, you know, the keeping state level GLCs accountable, it cannot be piecemeal. So it needs to come together with empowering our aduns, our state legislative assemblies to actually have substantive power to scrutinize state GLCs. each SLA needs to also have, say, like its own public accounts committee that has actual teeth that can call people for inquiries if there any corruption or any mismanagement happens. So a lot of changes needs to happen kind of concurrently, right? So empowering our lawmakers, having institutionalizing practices through law, and I think if we have both of this, then I think we can start talking about how we can have more intergovernmental coordination when it comes to transparency and accountability. So my worry is that a lot of spotlight goes to our federal level entities and not enough on the state level, when actually, Menteri Besar, Ketua Menteri at the state level have a lot of power over state GLC. So this is another, I would say, Pandora's box that needs to be tackled.
The discretionary authority, right? That also makes me think of the fact that perhaps state governments could actually be included in the decision-making process for GLCs that are operating at a regional level. And that could perhaps ensure some consistency, at least in how funds are managed and also allocated.
Yes. That used to be the process in the early 1960s, 1970s.
Right.
At the state level, they set up what is known as SEDCs, State Economic Development Corporations. Each state had them. At the national level, we had what is known as the Economic Policy Unit, EPU. Now, EPU would have direct links with the SEDCs. And that was good coordination, state and federal-state relations. Public funds, when it's channeled down to the ground, SEDCs will be in communication with EPU because EPU is the Economic Policy Unit. And they are determining policies, funds are going down to the ground. There's a coordination going on, and it used to work. And I said, it used to work. Now we have different parties controlling the state governments. EPU
there are far fewer bodies requiring oversight.
There are still SEDCs and state agriculture development corporations, which are very important. These were the original ones. But now at the state level too, like the federal level, they've set up so many. There's no coordination that I've seen, which is really close between federal and state. So when the funds go down, there's coordination. Secondly, there are federal institutions that are doing work similar to what's happening at the state level. The state level also have got their own statutory bodies and other institutions, say on agriculture. We have also the federal agencies looking at agriculture. But is there coordination between them? On marketing at the agricultural level, is there coordination going on? There's no coordination.
For example, we've also seen recent divestments by certain states, like Kedah, for example, unable to at the state level manage them, so it's selling them off. So now let's talk about how to optimize such a mechanism. Would a central coordinating body, such as maybe a national commission or oversight committee, be something to look into, Ira?
Yeah, so as we discussed previously, once the institutionalization of good governance and transparency happens through an act, then I think that should kickstart, concretizing these kind of measures at the state level as well. Because, I think what tends to happen, I think, is that now, especially now, we have different parties governing federal government and different at the state level, different parties and coalitions. There might be some room, right, to introduce maybe some competition between states on how well we can govern our entities. So we are seeing some initiatives from some state governments, such as Terengganu and Sarawak, where I think in Terengganu, the state government recently held a conference on how we can have good governance practices for their state level GLCs. How do we have competent board membership and discussions at the board level? So I am seeing some initiatives there at the state level, and hopefully that with the current political considerations, political variances that we have across states, there is more and more incentives, I think, for the Menteri Besar and Ketua Menteri in states to take up these initiatives. So, yeah, but I do think it needs to start at the federal level. Yeah.
Are you in agreement with
Yes.
that, or does it seem more interesting to also explore in tandem movement at the state level too?
I would prefer if it's done in tandem, but let's get real. I don't think it's going to happen in the current context that we have now. I would agree with Ira. I'd say let's start at the federal level.
Yeah.
Now, at the federal level, it's easier to do. And I'm glad you raised the point about the commission, because somebody must do this coordination. Do you know that the ministries are in business, and we have got about 20 over, nearly 24 ministries, a large number of them control a lot of institutions. Is there any coordination by the institutions controlled by these different ministers, even with each other?
That's right.
Is there overlap? Yes. If there's overlap and there's no coordination, we are talking about a serious problem of wastage of funds and resources going down to the ground and the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. That's the state of play. So who is going to bring about this coordination? At the moment, there's nobody. So if you have a commission and if you've got a committee which is in charge of looking at all these different institutions, looking at what the ministries are doing, take the responsibility out of the ministers. The ministers can come up with policies. The bureaucrats will be responsible for implementation, including implementing it in a way in which it's cost-saving, it's effective, it reaches to the ground, and it has productive outcomes. That's the route we have to take now. That's a lot of work, and they have to start the work now. You know, I don't see any political will to do that, because what that means is you're taking power away from the ministers in terms of the ability to shape implementation, because we do know that they do shape implementation. We do know they don't leave it to the bureaucrats. They direct the bureaucrats how to shape and implement the policies in their interest. And that's where we're seeing the problems arising. Is there political will to do that? I haven't seen that. I mean, I like what they're doing with the NAD and giving them more powers, but is that enough? I'm afraid no, that's not enough.
And well, thank you very much for all those insights and thoughts, Prof. Terence, as well as Ira from Ideas Malaysia. Well, that's all the time that we have for today on NIAGA Spotlight. We'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and future affairs insights. I'm Tamina Kowski signing off for now. Here's to a productive week ahead.